You believe your dollars have real value, that they represent something solid, something backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. But there was a specific Sunday evening when that faith became the only thing backing your money, and that evening was August 15th, 1971, when President Richard Nixon appeared on television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. And what most Americans didn't understand, what still isn't widely understood today, is that this wasn't a temporary measure to address a currency crisis. It was the permanent severing of the last connection between money and physical reality. It was the moment when dollars stopped being claims on something scarce and became purely fiat currency, backed by nothing except government promise and public confidence. And from that moment forward, every dollar you saved became subject to unlimited devaluation through mechanisms that couldn't exist when money was anchored to gold, and the purchasing power you thought you were protecting by saving dollars began eroding immediately, systematically, predictably, because the constraint that prevented excessive money creation had been removed, and nothing replaced it except institutional discipline that has proven absent every single time it's been tested. Let me show you what existed before August 15th, 1971, because understanding what was lost requires understanding what the gold standard actually did, what function it served, why its removal changed everything for savers, and the Bretton Woods system, established after World War II, created a framework where the dollar was convertible to gold at $35 per ounce, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar, and this meant that in theory, any country holding dollars could exchange them for physical gold from United States reserves. And while this convertibility was limited to foreign governments and central banks rather than individual American citizens who had been prohibited from owning monetary gold since 1933, the existence of this conversion mechanism created discipline, because if you printed too many dollars relative to your gold reserves, other countries would demand conversion. Your gold would flow out, and eventually you'd face a choice between stopping the printing or admitting the dollars weren't actually backed anymore. And this threat of gold outflow, this physical constraint, this limited how much currency could be created, how much inflation could be tolerated, how far monetary policy could be pushed before reality imposed consequences. But throughout the 1960s, the United States government spent beyond what it collected in taxes, financing both the Vietnam War and expanding domestic programs. And this required printing dollars, expanding the money supply, running deficits that grew larger each year, and as more dollars circulated internationally, as the gap between outstanding dollars and gold reserves widened, foreign governments began questioning whether the conversion promise could actually be honored, and France, under President Charles de Gaulle, started demanding gold in exchange for dollars, sending ships to New York to collect physical metal, and other countries watched this precedent, saw that conversion was possible, began calculating whether they should do the same before the gold ran out, and by 1971, the mathematics had become impossible to hide. There were roughly $78 billion in claims against $11 billion worth of gold at the official price, which meant that if even a fraction of dollar holders demanded conversion simultaneously, United States gold reserves would be exhausted, the promise would break, and the entire Bretton Woods system would collapse in a crisis of confidence that could take the dollar down with it. Faced with this reality, faced with the choice between stopping the printing that financed government priorities or admitting that the gold backing was insufficient, Nixon chose a third option, and that option was to close the gold window entirely, to sever the link between dollars and gold, to transform the dollar from a claim on something physical into pure fiat currency. And he presented this on television not as permanent policy, but as a temporary suspension, as a necessary defense against currency speculators who were attacking the dollar, and he promised that new international monetary arrangements would be negotiated, that this was just a pause while problems were resolved. But those negotiations never restored gold convertibility. They formalized floating exchange rates where currencies had value only relative to each other, where no currency was anchored to anything tangible, where every government could print as much money as political pressures demanded, limited only by fear of losing confidence. And that's the system we've operated under for over 50 years now. And what happened to savings during those 50 years reveals exactly what happens when the constraint is removed. Here's what most people miss about why this matters. Why August 15th, 1971 marks a crime against savers rather than just a policy change. because the removal of gold backing didn't just affect international monetary relations or currency exchange rates, it fundamentally changed the nature of what your savings represent. And before 71, when there was at least theoretical gold backing, when dollars represented claims on something with intrinsic scarcity, there was a limit to how much your savings could be debased, a physical constraint that made unlimited money creation impossible. But after 71, your dollars became claims on nothing except more dollars. Your savings became numbers in a system where the supply of those numbers could be expanded infinitely. And the only protection was institutional restraint, central bank discipline, government choosing not to print excessively. And every single time that discipline has been tested, every crisis, every emergency, every political pressure, the response has been identical. Print money, expand the money supply, monetize government debt, and transfer the cost to savers through inflation. Look at what happened immediately after the gold window closed, because the pattern started within months and has continued ever since. And inflation, which had been running at moderate levels during the 1960s despite government spending, accelerated dramatically through the 1970s, hitting double digits by the end of the decade, peaking above 13% in 1980, and if you had saved $10,000 in 1971, believing that dollars represented stable purchasing power, that saving was a reliable way to preserve wealth, by 1980, that $10,000 could buy roughly 40% of what it could buy in 71, which means you lost 60% of your purchasing power in less than a decade. And this wasn't because of some external shock or unpredictable disaster. This was the direct, predictable consequence of removing the constraint on money creation, and the people who suffered were the people who had trusted the system, who had saved in dollars, who had done everything conventional wisdom says is responsible, and they were systematically robbed through a mechanism that became possible only after gold backing was removed. Now here's the mechanism that makes this systematic rather than accidental, and understanding this mechanism is critical because it's still operating today, it's destroying purchasing power right now, it's the reason your savings lose value even when you do everything right. And the mechanism works like this. When government spends more than it collects in taxes, which happens almost every year, it needs to finance the deficit, and it does this by issuing bonds, and these bonds promise to repay. Dollars plus interest, but where do those repayment dollars come from when the government is already spending beyond its income? And the answer, the only answer possible in a pure fiat system, is that the Federal Reserve creates them, creates new money to purchase government bonds. And this money creation expands the money supply, and when the money supply expands faster than the production of real goods and services, the result is inflation, which means each dollar can buy less, which means your savings denominated in dollars lose purchasing power. And this isn't a side effect. This isn't an unfortunate accident. This is how modern governments manage debt that can't be repaid through normal economic growth. They inflate it away, they devalue the currency in which it's denominated, and savers, the people holding that currency, bear the entire cost. And here's why removing gold backing in 1971 made this inevitable rather than possible, because under gold standard constraints, even theoretical constraints, there was a limit to how much money could be created before the system faced reckoning, before the gap between printed dollars and gold backing became so obvious that confidence broke. But once that connection was severed, once money became pure fiat with no anchor, the limits became psychological rather than physical, became about managing confidence rather than maintaining conversion rates. And confidence can be shaped, manipulated, sustained through communication and policy in ways that physical gold reserves cannot. And this shift from physical constraint to confidence management fundamentally changed the risks facing savers. Because physical constraints are absolute, they force consequences regardless of political pressure. But confidence constraints are flexible. They can be stretched. They can be tested. They can be exceeded as long as trust holds. And trust, it turns out, can be maintained much longer than physical resources can be created. If you're following this series, if you've watched the episode on the crime of 1933 when gold ownership was criminalized, you're starting to see how these crimes connect, how each one enabled the next, because the confiscation of private gold in 33 made it possible to sever gold backing in 71, and severing gold backing in 71 made it possible to implement the policies that came after, the quantitative easing, the zero interest rates, the massive money creation that has accelerated over the past 2 decades, and people who follow this documentary archive episode by episode, who subscribe and turn on notifications, who watch each historical crime as it gets examined, they're building something most people never develop, which is pattern recognition, which is the ability to see current policy announcements and understand them not through official justifications, but through historical precedent. And this pattern recognition is what separates people who see what's coming from people who trust institutions that have demonstrated repeatedly they will sacrifice savers to preserve system stability. Once you see the system, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to believing that your savings are protected when the entire history since 1971 demonstrates that protection doesn't exist, that the constraint that made protection possible was deliberately removed, that every promise about maintaining purchasing power has been broken systematically, and this understanding changes everything about how you evaluate financial risk. Because if the system is designed to transfer value from savers to institutions through inflation, if this transfer accelerates during every crisis, if the removal of gold backing made this transfer unlimited rather than constrained, then strategies that assume dollars maintain value are strategies built on false premises, and following those strategies leads predictably to the outcome we've seen repeatedly over 50 years, which is gradual, then sudden erosion of purchasing power, retirement savings that buy far less than projected, security that evaporates despite decades of careful planning. Now let me show you the specific numbers that prove this isn't theory or speculation, but documented destruction of savings, because in 1971 you could buy a gallon of gasoline for 36 cents, a new car for roughly $3,500, a median home for roughly $28,000, a first-class postage stamp for 8 cents, and if you had accumulated $50,000 by 1971, that represented substantial wealth, enough to buy a nice home with money left over, enough to retire modestly, enough to feel financially secure. But if you held that $50,000 in savings accounts or bonds, earning the interest rates available at that time, by 1980, your purchasing power had been cut almost in half, not because you made bad decisions, not because you were imprudent or reckless, but because the system was restructured in 1971 in a way that made this outcome inevitable, that removed the constraint, preventing it, that prioritized government ability to print money over savers' ability to preserve wealth. And the destruction didn't stop in 1980. It's continued ever since, compounding year after year, decade after decade, because once the gold backing was removed, once the constraint disappeared, every subsequent crisis produced the same response. Create more money, inflate the currency, transfer the cost to savers, and by now, 50-plus years after Nixon closed the gold window, a dollar buys roughly 15% of what it bought in 1971, which means 85% of purchasing power has been destroyed, and this happened not through random inflation or external shocks, but through systematic policy enabled by the removal of gold backing, through deliberate choices to expand money supply, to monetize government debt, to prioritize institutional preservation over individual wealth protection. Think about what this means for anyone trying to save for retirement in this system, because if you're 50 years old now and planning to retire at 70, you're trusting that the dollars you save over the next 20 years will maintain purchasing power through 20 or 30 years of retirement. But the entire history since 1971 demonstrates that this trust is misplaced, that purchasing power erodes systematically, that the rate of erosion accelerates during crises, that institutions respond to every financial stress by printing money and devaluing your savings, and you can't protect yourself by saving more or working longer because the mechanism operates at the currency level. It affects every dollar you hold, regardless of how carefully you accumulated them, and the only protections are either leaving the dollar system entirely, which faces legal obstacles and practical difficulties, or understanding the system well enough to position wealth in forms that maintain value despite currency debasement. And most people never develop this understanding because it requires seeing through official narratives to historical patterns, and that requires exactly the kind of systematic education this series provides. Now here's where this connects to the present moment, because the mechanisms created by removing gold backing in 1971 are operating at unprecedented scale right now, and since the 2008 financial crisis, The Federal Reserve has created over $8 trillion through quantitative easing and other programs, which is more money creation than occurred in the entire 200-year history of the United States before 2008. And this money creation was possible only because gold backing had been removed, only because the constraint that would have forced reckoning decades ago no longer existed, and the stated justification was preventing economic collapse, supporting employment, maintaining financial stability. But the actual effect, the documented outcome, was inflation in asset prices that benefited people who already owned assets while destroying purchasing power for people holding currency and fixed income investments. And this is the exact pattern that's repeated since 1971, the exact mechanism through which wealth gets transferred from savers to institutions and from wage earners to asset owners. And here's what makes this moment particularly important. Because the debt that's been accumulated since 71, the obligations that governments have taken on believing they could always print more money to service them, those obligations are approaching mathematical limits, with United States federal debt exceeding $35 trillion, with interest payments consuming over $1 trillion annually, with demographic pressures and entitlement obligations growing faster than economic capacity to support them. And at some point, probably within the lifetime of people watching this video, the system faces a choice between defaulting explicitly by refusing to pay obligations or defaulting implicitly by creating so much money that inflation destroys the real value of both the debt and the savings held by ordinary people. And based on every historical precedent, based on what happened after 71 and after every crisis since, they will choose inflation. They will choose to print. They will choose to destroy your savings rather than admit the system failed. And the only question is how fast this happens, whether it's gradual erosion over decades or accelerated destruction over years. But the direction is certain because the crime of 1971 removed the constraint that could prevent it. And this is why following this series matters, why subscribing and watching each episode as it releases is fundamentally different from seeing random videos about economics or history, because we're building a framework chronologically, showing you first how gold was confiscated in 33, then how gold backing was removed in 71, then how each subsequent crisis activated mechanisms that these earlier crimes made possible, and people who follow this documentary archive, sequentially, who turn on all notifications, who watch each new historical crime as it gets documented. They're developing cumulative understanding that compounds, where each episode adds value to every previous episode, where connections become visible that isolated viewing can never reveal. And this understanding is what separates people who see their savings destroyed from people who position themselves to survive currency debasement, because positioning requires seeing clearly, seeing early, seeing through the official narratives to the historical patterns, and that's exactly what this series provides. So here's what needs to happen, and I'm being direct because understanding is urgent and incomplete. Understanding is almost as dangerous as ignorance. Subscribe to this channel right now, turn on all notifications, because the next video in this series examines what happened after the gold backing was removed, how the crime of 71 enabled the financial destruction of the 1970s, how inflation destroyed savings at rates Americans had never experienced in peacetime, how the mechanisms we've discussed today operated in practice, and once you see how removing gold backing in 71 led directly to the inflation crisis that followed, how each crime builds the foundation for the next, how the system has evolved over 50 years toward greater extraction and less accountability, you'll understand why these aren't just history lessons, why they're warnings, why the patterns that destroyed wealth in the past are operating right now at larger scale with more dangerous implications, and why people who understand this early make fundamentally different choices about how they hold wealth, where they position assets, how they think about retirement security, than people who trust blindly in systems that have proven they will sacrifice individuals to preserve institutional power. But subscription alone doesn't complete understanding, because what we're building here is more than a video archive. It's a community investigation into how power operates through monetary systems across time, into how governments use currency manipulation to transfer wealth, into how individuals can recognize and potentially protect themselves from mechanisms that operate at scales too large and timeframes too long for most people to perceive. And that investigation doesn't happen through Passive viewing. It happens through active engagement, through examining evidence, through testing analysis against each other's reasoning, through allowing disagreement to strengthen rather than weaken understanding. And this is why the comments aren't peripheral, they're central. They're where the video's thesis gets examined rigorously, where experience meets theory, where people share insights the video couldn't cover and challenge claims that need challenging. So the video doesn't end when the screen goes black. It continues here in the comments. And here's what I want you to think through and discuss. If removing gold backing in 1971 eliminated the physical constraint on money creation and led directly to 50+ years of systematic savings destruction through inflation, if this inflation wasn't accidental but was the predictable consequence of removing constraints, if every crisis since '71 has produced identical responses of money printing and currency debasement, then what does this tell us about the nature of pure fiat currency systems, about whether restraint can ever be maintained when it depends purely on institutional discipline rather than physical limits? And more practically, what strategies make sense for preserving wealth when the currency itself is designed to lose value, when the constraint preventing unlimited devaluation was deliberately removed, when history shows clearly that dollars lose purchasing power systematically, and when all conventional advice assumes that saving dollars will preserve wealth, despite all evidence showing the opposite? And at what point does following conventional advice become irrational, and what alternatives exist that don't require breaking laws or taking excessive risks? And how do ordinary people navigate a system rigged against them when the rigging is legal, official, defended by experts who benefit from the system continuing exactly as it operates? Write your reasoning carefully. Read what others have written. Respond with evidence and logic rather than emotion or ideology, because this space has become something rare and valuable, a place where serious people examine difficult questions without pretending easy answers exist, where disagreement strengthens analysis rather than ending conversation, where the goal is understanding rather than winning arguments, and your perspective matters, your experience contributes, your willingness to engage seriously with ideas that challenge mainstream narratives makes this community effective, and this continuation through dialogue is itself part of the series, part of how understanding deepens beyond what any video can provide alone. So treat this as investigation, not consumption, and share your analysis below.